And our final, but by no means least, talk of today is Tea, a Platform for Voices by Navjot Mangat from the Horniman Museum and Gardens. Navjot is the Senior Curator of Social Practice at the Horniman Museum and Gardens. His work focuses on participatory practice and its application across different strands of museum work. He curated the community-developed Tea exhibition and is currently consulting on a new community-led collecting project. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, can you hear me properly? I know it's the last session, I know you've had a lot of information. I'm really sorry because I'm about to throw tons at you as well. But I will try kind of speed through some bits. I'm going to put my timer on as well. And I will do my best. I will stick to time. I'm not going to do my best, I will stick to time. As mentioned, I'm Navjot Mangat. I'll talk a little bit more about the role, but I wanted to kind of go into the museum. This is the Horniman Museum in Forest Hill, South London. I always get the number wrong, but I'm just going to say them out. So there's an anthropology collection, a living collection of alpacas and aquarium fish things. There is a natural sciences collection, a musical instrument collection. I think that's it. And a great handling collection as well, like a really, really good handling collection. And I think there should be some parity between those collections as well. So big up our kind of handling collection that we have there. We were founded by Frederick Horniman, who is a tea merchant. Here he is in the left hand, kind of standing on a tea crate, kind of ironically kind of highlighting that point clear. And the Horniman Museum was funded through the proceeds of the sale of tea, essentially. And this is where the idea of the kind of tea exhibition came about, well before I joined. I've been there for about 3 years now. And even in the interview, they were like, if we were going to do an exhibition on tea, how would you do it? I was like, I'm not really sure, but we'll kind of figure it out. And when I kind of came in, and I did get the job based on, not that kind of answer, but I was like, I think the response was, we'll work with people, right? This is the entire point of it is Senior Curator of Social Practice as opposed to anthropology. And I remember coming in, and this is the actual slide that I wrote down really early on, and the purpose of the exhibition was twofold from the beginning. One was kind of addressing the colonial legacy of the Horniman and its relationship to tea, the Opium Wars, the colonization of northwest India as well, and what happened in East Africa in terms of tea plantations, but then also, and I kind of write in a real woolly way, centering the communities that are most impacted at the heart of the conversation. And then I was like, I had to try to figure out what that means. And kind of going into the role, it comes back to this idea of, what is the Senior Curator of Social Practice? And I say this a lot, I'm Senior Curator of Social Practice, and that's the response I get. I don't know what that thing is in the middle, but I think it's really funny, so I kind of keep it up here, right? So that, what is this thing that you do? And, do you work on anything? I do have a collections remit. I have a curatorial remit of the Asia collection and the Americas collection, but ultimately, it's about people. My work is about working with people, sharing, centering, platforming, facilitating, at the core of what I do. And it used to be about collections. I came in thinking about how can I connect people to collections, but it's become more than that. It's about how do I connect people to the space, the place of Forest Hill, the stories that they might have, all the stories that they might want to share. And really, it's my job then to work on that and kind of go with the flow, as I say, which is my way of saying I don't really know, but I will do my best to facilitate what our kind of stakeholders want and need. And in doing that, in being a Senior Curator of Social Practice, I get it is the act of applying this thing to what happens in museums. And the first case study was, how do I build an exhibition with a community-centered process at the core of it? And then, how do you kind of co-develop an exhibition? How do you build something? And how do you kind of do this thing of placing the communities that are most impacted by this narrative at the center of it? And we begin with definitions. Now, I've worked at the National Maritime Museum, the National Art Museum, V&A East, before I came to the Horniman, and they're all great organizations. They all have like this community-rooted practice, but the word co-curation and co-production and kind of consultation differs across the board. So when we came to the Horniman, I was like, actually, we're going to have some very clear definitions, and the point of this is not to say this is how you should do it. The point of this is largely about accountability for myself to our kind of key stakeholders. I'm not going to go into this too much because of the time that we have, but I'm going to touch on key points. Consultation, I do not kind of throw into the kind of co-development category. It's incredibly important, but it's testing ideas. And what we do at the Horniman is, once kind of decision is made that sits with the museum, we will send out a consultation summary and report to those stakeholders. Co-production. This is mostly what kind of the tea exhibition was based on. This is when a curator has an idea and will say, actually, there's a curatorial message that I would like to respond to. This might be a video, this might be a bus, this might be you responding to something, but it ultimately is about a kind of stakeholder group responding to something that a curatorial message has been set. Co-curation. This is when I work with the group to figure out what that curatorial message is from the get-go. So instead of me saying to someone, hey, let's talk about tea plantations, how would you like to respond to that? It's actually, what do we want to say about tea plantations? What is the kind of narrative that we want to kind of explore? What objects do we want to be in those kind of spaces? And you'll notice throughout these, a key thing to point out is who has final sign-off. When we go into co-production, co-curation, co-design, our stakeholders should have final sign-off on everything, which also prolongs an entire process. And the point of this kind of presentation is to talk about what that means for our roles in these spaces when we kind of try to enact these approaches. And co-design, this one's the hardest one. I don't think I've ever done this properly, where you work with stakeholders from the get-go. It's a longer-term commitment, and it involves the development and designing. And this works really well with programs and stuff, but I think sometimes with exhibitions, because the run-ins of those exhibitions can be 2-3 years long, it's really about the commitment of those stakeholders, but also kind of what they want to do and how they want to work with you as well. I think it's an important thing to point out. None of these is better than the other. Really good consultation, in my opinion, is better than poor co-curation. So it's largely about what works for your stakeholders, speaking to people. And something I want to kind of drill, and kind of I think I'm going to repeat throughout this kind of presentation, is this concept of within the Horniman, within this exhibition, I tried to move away from this idea of a collections-based form of engagement, right? So I didn't want to kind of work with stakeholder communities from Southeast Asia, East Asia, West Asia, and say, these are the collections that we have, what do you think about them? I instead began with the needs of the community stakeholders and then thought about how the collection can support those needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And based on those needs, it might be any one of these models. Remuneration. This hasn't been mentioned today, but I'm assuming it kind of is within the kind of framework of how people work. And also, it's worth me pointing out, we do pay people for their time. This is very different depending on how the kind of size of your organization is, your funding models, but it is always worth considering, when people talk about how difficult it is to reach communities, it's also worth figuring out, what they're getting out of this. Our kind of processes in museums can be incredibly extractive when we ask people to come in and give us information, and what we expect them to kind of gain from it is this kind of sense of cultural capital from engaging with the objects. As stewards of collections, this is what we should be doing full stop, to be perfectly honest. So it's about figuring out how we can support those needs of those organizations and how we can support those needs of those stakeholders. And again, this should be factored into budgets as well. And with the tea exhibition, it wasn't. So it wasn't factored into the budget, and we kind of ended up having reworking things and going out to funders. But again, I'll kind of go into that. Consultation. So I kind of began with consultation for the exhibition, and a question that's been asked that I'll kind of try preempt is, how do you reach out to people? I kind of begin with, well, who are those communities that the story of tea centered on? And for this, it was Asian communities, and I wanted to keep it broad. I was really I've been used to working with very singular groups and communities, whether it be someone saying, actually, we're now going to work with an East Asian community, or we're going to work with so-and-so community from this place on this particular topic. I was like, actually, I want to create kind of an intercommunal dialogue. And what I'll do is I'll reach out to kind of organizations that are doing the active work that is the need of those communities. So, for example, one group was Hackney Chinese Community Services. They work on immigration legislation. They work on hate crime. They run food kitchens. And I thought, actually, I'll reach out to them. Also, another group was the British Asian Collective, who were back then called Dear Asian Youth. And they were an inter-Asian, kind of intercommunal young group of Asian people kind of connecting and having dialogues about what decoloniality means to them in terms of telling Asian stories. So we reached out and we began consulting on messaging. Really early on, when we're consulting on this, is really trying to figure out what the needs of those organizations are. They're paid for this time. It's also me talking about what's in the collection. We then do this mapping out. These are the actual slides of kind of what came out of those sessions, of how do people want to feel? What are the narratives? What are the themes that you're kind of interested in? And then you don't really need to know this fully, but you see those purple blocks was kind of me suggesting to people, this is how you might want to work. And really early on, someone said, why must we be told where we're going to be in a kind of exhibition and within a space? And often, I think in our heads, we go, as a big exhibition space, 2 community projects, one will go in this area, one will go in that area. It's kind of co-production model. But they were like, well, why don't you just let's pick and choose? So we adopted that. And another kind of thing that we ended up doing is I kind of have Mentimeter or any kind of notes that people can take, and I'll use them. And I want them to I want consultation to be critical because we do want change to come out of it. And I think something that we don't consider often is when people are doing consultation, people are generally quite nice. So people are like, yeah, this is all right, this is cool. But I want those raw notes as I'm speaking for them to go, actually, I'm a bit concerned about this. And what we see on the left-hand side is people felt that initially the consultation kind of pitch was nuanced, what people were concerned about was actually, is this an oversimplification of the narrative of the history of tea? They were worried about, because of the way the objects looked, is this going to end up being a cabinet of curiosities? So then we actively thought about that as we continued building the exhibition. Some key changes that were made really early on were we decided to begin with the story of tea prior to any European colonization. We left Horniman right to the end. We then focused on the story of kind of tea coming to Britain, conflict and colonialism, and then we closed off with what's happening with tea workers today, so a bigger dialogue of contemporary issues, and then a kind of reflection of what tea means to communities. We do have critical friends. I kind of bring on critical friends that can kind of answer these questions about the history of this topic, whereas the communities might want to be focusing on actually their own purpose and what they're working on and their kind of own goals in terms of supporting the mental health of the service users they might be working with, kind of increasing their profile, talking about a particular history. So critical friends is something worth considering as to kind of how they add into this narrative. And it also kind of covers that gap where you might ask actually, where is this knowledge production coming from? It still exists with people within that diaspora and source communities that are kind of happy to kind of offer that. Again, these people are paid for their time. The design consultation group. I'm going to skip this group because of the kind of time barrier, but one of the key things to point out is that one of those worries was the cabinet of curiosity. So we brought in about 5 or 6 individuals from that initial consultation that said that they might be interested in thinking about how the space looks. And they worked with us to build a design brief. And what they wanted was a sense of comfort, warmth, familiarity, and they built with us a kind of color palette. And this was the first then concept design that the designers came back with after that brief, and they hated it. The community hated it. They're like, this is terrible. And they go, why are jar and chai, these 2 indigenous kind of terms smaller than the word tea? It looks like an energy logo, was another thing that someone said. They go, I'm not really happy with the green. And then it became this, right? And this kind of highlights, again, a moment of good consultation kind of trumping kind of any kind of work, because this ended up influencing the kind of color palette. This presentation that you're seeing kind of came out of that initial work as well. And then I'm going to go into like this co-development thing, like how we worked with people. And I think an important thing to point out is we did this open model thing. So I kind of sent people a map of the space and said, based on the initial consultation, these are the themes. And everyone that was in consultation was then asked, if you want to take part, this is how much we'll kind of figure out you're being paid. You're not being paid for the session, you're being paid the 2 hours of time, but you're being paid for emails that you might read before, emails that you're reading afterwards, any kind of work that you're doing. So we had these kind of things laid out. And what was interesting is everyone said, yeah, great, we're on it. And they all sent us kind of what they're interested in. And not a single person, not a single group, and I worked with 70 people in the end, picked conflict and colonization. They didn't want to work on it. They were like, we're not interested in kind of telling this story, which is interesting because I think in our head we often go, if we're going to tell a decolonial story, we're going to talk about imperialism, we should work with communities. But I'll get to kind of why that kind of happens. As they kind of selected what form their work took, some people wanted to make films. One of my favorite kind of modes, and like I said, because there's so many partners, I focus on one story. One group, Hackney Chinese Community Services, said, we want to talk about our personal relationships to elements of tea history. It was a group of 5. When I was like, all right, cool, we'll think about it, we'll all meet up together. We met up together, they go, actually, we refuse to work with each other anymore. I go, why, what's happened? And they go, we don't disagree with each other, but we all want to work on our own specific spaces. So in my head, a model of 5 workshops with a group of 5 now became 20 workshops, which are one-to-one chats, basically. And we ended up doing these big interviews and whatnot, and then people were like, I go, how do you want this kind of articulated within the space? How do you want it to look? We can kind of bring in an artist. We have this illustrator that we kind of brought in that was connected to us through Dear Asian Youth. You can see the illustrations. Like, we can do lots of interesting things. They would just put our quotes on the wall. And I was like, okay, it's a text-heavy exhibition. They were like, just make them really, really big then. And I did it. So I was like, you know what, we'll give it a shot. And also, if you tell yourself this is a pilot project enough times, you can afford to fail, right? So I was like, we'll do it. We'll do what you need us to do, basically. In a similar style, we then ended up commissioning a film in South India of tea workers, their daily lives. They had a really interesting conversation with us where I got on the phone with one of our critical friends, Shobita Banerjee, who'd kind of facilitated that relationship. And she goes, yeah, the tea workers are sending you a sari, a bag of leaves, and just lots of things. I go, I'm not sure I have anywhere to put them. She goes, well, you can figure it out. And I then spoke to our conservation team. They're like, where are these bag of leaves at the moment? I go, oh, yeah, they're in reception. Go, you can't just have a bag of leaves that have come from South India that are just now. These are wet tea leaves as well to flag. These are pre-pro. It's not a good thing I did, all right? But I agreed to it. And in the end, what we did end up having is that mannequin. It kind of highlighted and articulated the story of what tea workers go through every single day. But it highlights that when you kind of offer and give space to kind of co-curators to do and choose what they want, they should take it. And it becomes our job to then facilitate that however we wish to kind of make that journey happen. Work with transparency. Budgets were shared. If I have a spreadsheet, you have the spreadsheet. So if you're looking at how much I've spent, you can take a look at it. Each group was given 4.5K. Within that, they were given their own fees, and then I believe 2.5K to work on the actual development of their work. So the British Asian Collective wanted to make a coffee table. They built that. They wanted to commission some artworks. They did that as well. And then really early on, I said that no one picked conflict and colonialism. And I kind of left it. I was like, you know what? I don't know what to do. But one of the groups said, how are you working on that, by the way? How's that coming along? I said, it's a bit difficult because I'm not entirely sure what the community wants me to say. They go, we want you to still do it. And it turned out it's because talking about conflict and colonialism in the context of them being Hong Kongers talking about what's happened in China and them having come recently to the country, they might put themselves at risk. And now this wasn't articulated to me 6 months in advance, but it was articulated to me after that trust was built. So they go, it's still your curatorial responsibility to tell that story. We would have told you no in consultation. I'm done for time, but I'll speed through, I promise. But we still want you to do it, which kind of highlights, again, our curatorial responsibility, and not all the answers should come from our kind of stakeholders. It's also about what they want to kind of share. And also a bigger question about decoloniality can be about taking up space for joy, for celebration, for sharing your own stories without having a narrative centered on imperial violence. Obviously, it makes sense sometimes, but what I've learned is, if I hadn't asked that question, if I hadn't given the freedom, or haven't kind of said, pick and choose what you want, we may have forced the group to be in a situation where, they were uncomfortable. Now, 3 months before the exhibition, someone comes and says, I'm now ready to talk about conflict and colonialism. I was like, why are you doing this to me? But it's like, all my family have now moved to the UK. I really want to do it. And what you'll see is that you'll see this illustration of people at the bottom. To anonymize everyone, we ended up illustrating them. So again, it's a design solution to figure out how we can safeguard our kind of stakeholders and work with them. But that was a quick response. We ended up cutting half a subsection from the exhibition, but we got their views within the space. Text editing. I'm going to skip this part, but really, in short, everyone worked on all elements of this. I've still got 5 minutes. We're good to go. Actually, yeah, we'll talk about it. All the text was edited by our critical friends, as well as anyone that worked on the section. So if you're a group that worked on this subsection, you'd have sign-off on all the text within that area. But our 5 critical friends that I mentioned earlier looked at all the text. And after the first draft, our kind of Horniman's kind of interpretive approach is share what happened. And I think often in museums we'll say to people, don't tell visitors how to feel, right? We hear this a lot. Don't tell visitors how to feel. They can make their own decisions. And we shared this with the group, and that first kind of sentence really kind of brought it home to us that actually, when we do that, when we're kind of saying things that have happened in terms of like brutality of empire, we say it almost kind of as statistics. We don't allow people to feel the anger. We don't allow people to kind of feel upset. And this group wanted to feel that. They wanted space to kind of have that conversation. They wanted space to kind of engage with those emotions. As a result, I shared this with our project manager. And in advance, in all fairness, going into this process, I'd said, if it takes us 3 months to usually write text, a sign-off process of 3-4 people, it should now take us 6 months, because we're now having that many people extra kind of signing it off and going through extra versions of it. Also, politics of language. And this now goes back to this dialogue of knowledge production and what we gain out of collections. This wouldn't have been possible if I just kept showing people, like, here are the collections that we're working with. When we came to interpretation, people started having a dialogue around traditional characters, how language is used, ethnicities and dialects, but that again came through months of trust building, which has then, I think, influenced over 1,000 objects within our collection on MIMSI, where I'm going, actually, this equates to these particular ethnic groups, these particular languages, but it also then highlights our own understanding of our collection from the needs of those communities. Now, if you're wondering what that need was, a lot of our Hong Konger kind of audiences and key stakeholders are talking about actually, as Hong Kongers, we want to retain our identity, so we really want to talk about the retention of our language and how that's shred and what's made accessible. And these kind of dialogues became more and more prominent as the kind of process came along. And ultimately, towards the end, I mean, we kind of did this exhibition and it kind of focused on, the lives of tea workers, climate crisis, social responsibility, and it was really never about tea towards the end of it. It was actually, again, more about people and consumerism, about our relationships, but it could have definitely just been about Wedgwood teapots, which I've got no beef with Wedgwood teapots, but no beef at all. But I think it then became a little bit more about what people want to make this exhibition, right? And again, this comes out to this point of, through this process of using the collection as a tool to support our stakeholders, it became something more, and there was a lot more kind of ownership of the exhibition as well. And these are just quotes that have come from people that we've worked with, but also visited the exhibition. It's now closed. It opened in like October 23, I want to say, and closing in 24. 180,000 visitors, which is decent for the Horniman's numbers. And it's really kind of changed our own engagement with the communities as well. One thing that we ended up and really aimed to do is kind of build a legacy project. So in the next 3 months or so, we're going to be thinking about the consultation plan of how we embed the story of the history of the Horniman, this history of tea within the organization. But also it's now led to a lot more interesting conversations. Again, I said I often go with the flow. So half of our group that kind of came back after tea and said, we want to talk about what community-led collections care looks like from a spiritual level. So we've seen objects in your collection, for example, and now we're coming to you and saying, you know, how are these objects being taken care of? We think there is a kind of spiritual and religious care that maybe the museum isn't doing, and we're kind of veering more towards kind of deconsecration work with those communities, with other stakeholders, again, talking a little bit more about further projects and artistic work that can kind of go along with that. And again, this is talking a little bit more about some of the responses that came out of that. We did have a big program that was related to the project. But yeah, that was, in short, Chai Tea, and hopefully I didn't bombard you with too much. Forgive me if I've I have run over, right? I haven't run over. That's fantastic. But thank you, everyone.